Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video, giving the extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I'm going to concentrate on one single topic tonight, and that is something that's come up in my threads on my YouTube videos over the last, well, I guess quite a few times over the last however long. It pertains to the battle for Bakhmut, and this comes from pro-Russian voices who say, well, what's your proof that Ukraine are having an advantageous troop ratio, that Russia are losing way more troops than the Ukrainians? And here is my answer to that. I have said all these things a number of times. It's not as if I haven't justified my conclusion or my claim. So I'm just going to compile this all into one hopefully useful video that I can just refer people back to when they make these sorts of claims going forward. And they will. So are we justified in thinking Russia have lost far more troops in Bakhmut than Ukraine? Let's assess the evidence. And evidence can come in different shapes and sizes. It doesn't have to be like hard data. Rationale, good reasons are evidence. They are forms of evidence you can put forward to give this cumulative case that Russia really are losing more than Ukraine. And I guess we could do this. You could do a Bayesian analysis of this. You could look at abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is inference to the best explanation, and that's kind of what I'll be doing today. Inference to the best explanation means if you have two competing hypotheses, for example, or more, but we're going to have two competing hypotheses. One is Russia are losing more troops than the Ukrainians, and the other hypothesis is Russia aren't losing more troops than the Ukrainians. When you have some data, you say, okay, which hypothesis does this better support? And I'm going to show you a dozen or so arguments and bits of data that better support the hypothesis that Russia really are losing more troops than Ukraine. So where should we start? First argument is this: Ukraine are still defending Bakhmut. It's almost like obvious this, but if Ukraine were getting hammered in Bakhmut, if they were losing more troops than the Russians, then they wouldn't still be there. The calculus is that it is worth them staying there because they are attriting Russian troops at a rate that is advantageous for them. We've heard of lots of different ratios, and we'll come to talk about that in a second. They are still there. They are claiming that the ratio is in their favor, and they are saying we are still there because the ratio is in our favor. One of the objectives here is, one of them is fixing the Russian troops, yeah, and the other is the attritional ratio is in their favor. They are still there. So it would be insane if Ukraine were like, okay, let's stay here, but we're going to lose way more troops than the Russians. Oh no, we are losing way more troops than Russians. Let's just stay here anyway. Hey, it's all for a laugh, right? No, that's their primary resource is their trained Ukrainian forces, and if they are going to just, fritter them away in this way, then that's an insane decision to make. And if they want to win this war, then they are not going to be making insane decisions. So the fact that they are still there indicates that the Russians are indeed losing more than the Ukrainians. Okay, next argument. Ukrainians have consistently claimed that the loss ratio of Ukrainians to Russians has been at times, so that's Russians to Ukrainians, 7-1 and 5-1. I got that the wrong way round. So here we have just a tweet that sort of talks about this. Not even close. Flip that and you're in the ballpark. A close friend is there and has been since Bakhmut got hot. He said the 8-1 claim Ukraine states is exaggerated, but it is easily 5 or 6-1 on any given day. Aside from sticking their heads out, the Russians keep running into rigged positions. These claims have been consistent throughout the whole time Russia have been attacking Bakhmut. The original claims were sort of 7-1, then it went to 5-1, and it's almost certainly much closer than 5-1 now. But the idea is those claims are there, and those claims are coming from primary sources as well. People on the ground there are making those claims. So that's the next argument. There have been countless Ukrainian primary source claims of the Russians using human wave tactics. So there have been primary source claims of the ratio being there or thereabouts. We've seen that Kenneth Gregg and his sources on the ground. I've given you plenty of claims, primary source claims that have been reported on social media and in different articles. So I've given you those claims. There have been countless Ukrainian primary source claims of the Russians using human wave tactics. This has led Ukrainians to claim that it was like fighting zombie hordes. So I have covered up the pictures there. There were two pictures of just fields of Russian dead bodies, just Russian dead bodies everywhere. It's inappropriate, so I can't show that. Vuhledar is far from the biggest failure. 2022 spring was a failure, and Vuhledar was the only place with tanks. Near Bakhmut, there are real human waves, and the evidence is there. And then the Atlantic Council wrote a report saying human wave tactics are demoralizing the Russian army in Ukraine. And I could give you plenty and plenty and plenty of sources and evidence that the Russians are using human wave tactics there. And if you're using human wave tactics, you are throwing people at the problem to solve the problem. And the problem here is we need that territory. How do we get that territory? Let's just human wave it. And so they were recruiting huge amounts of convicts. It wasn't always the case, but then they started recruiting these convicts and then using them to try and take territory in a human wave way. It's not the only tactic that Wagner and the Russians are using in Bakhmut, but it has been a significant tactic over a large period of the Russian offensive there. And that's a very expensive way of gaining ground. It just, they are using that. Everyone knows they're using that. The claims on both sides that they're using that. We've seen primary source Russian claims, videos and intercepted calls, and primary source Ukrainian claims. So they are using human tactics. And what hypothesis does that better support? That the Russians are losing more troops than the Ukrainians, or the Ukrainians are losing more troops than the Russians? Military theory is that attacking forces will lose more troops than defenders, all things remaining equal, ceteris paribus. I haven't got anything to support that because it's all on the next page. So basically, military theory is that if you're going to attack somewhere, you're going to need at least 3-1, and you're going to need at least 3-1 force ratio because actually you need to overwhelm the defenders. Otherwise, if you're basically on parity in terms of forces, then you're going to lose the same amount of people. Now, all things remaining equal, that's just two armies that are of the same skill level and equipment facing each other. You're going to lose the same amount of people, okay, depending on tactics you might use. Okay, but now this is in an urban environment. So now you're supposed to have 5-1, 7-1, 9-1 ratio if you're attacking in an urban environment. Did the Russians ever have that ratio? No. So they don't have the force quantity to overwhelm the Ukrainians in an urban environment, which means it's going to be expensive for them to gain that territory. It's going to be more expensive for them than it should be, than it could be potentially be if they had the right force quantity and quality. But attacking in urban areas, military theory claims, the attacking force should have, as I say, 5-9-1. Russia have never remotely had this ratio. And in fact, if you look at the 8 rules of urban warfare and why, I won't go into it and why we must work to change them. It was a different point. But the Modern War Institute talks about these 8 different urban rules of urban warfare. The urban defender has the advantage. So the defender has the advantage. The urban terrain reduces the attacker's advantage in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, the utility of aerial assets, and the attacker's ability to engage at distance. The defender can see and engage the attacker coming because the attacker has limited cover and concealment. Buildings serve as fortified bunkers that must be negotiated. Attackers must use explosive force to penetrate buildings. The defender maintains relative freedom of maneuver within the urban terrain. The underground serves as the defender's refuge, and neither the attacker nor the defender can concentrate their forces against the other. Okay, so all of those things are the case for Bakhmut, and all of those things give the advantage to the defender. So what you would expect is that the defender will take fewer casualties than the attacker because the defender has the advantage. So because the defender has that advantage, you need a massive force to overwhelm them. And the Russians just don't have that massive force. Yes, they're using human waves, but they don't have a 9-to-1 force ratio. And they have never had that. And so what they're doing is, in certain areas, using human waves to try and overcome those defender advantages, but at the cost of those humans that they're sending in. So again, what would this theoretically and empirically, because these are the advantages the Ukrainians have, what would this better support? Hypothesis would this better support? And the conclusion to that piece is, if militaries fail to address these rules, the city attack will remain one of the missions with the most tactical, accidental, and political risk. Yes, it has all that risk. It will continue to drive combat into urban areas where weaker combatants can use the advantages they gain for short-term political wins. Now, the Ukrainians aren't weaker either. They might not have enough artillery ammunition and certain bits of ammunition here and there, but in terms of force quality, they are arguably better trained soldiers than the Russians that are being sent against them. So, in fact, this is all in looking bad for the Russians here. It's not to the Russians' advantage. What hypothesis would this better support? Number 6, there's a huge amount of video footage to show trenches full of dead Russians. So in Bakhmut, and there's stuff I can't show you, but there are I have seen footage of trenches, and that video on the right of your screen there, and the one on the left, but the one on the right, I have shown you that image of it at the end because you can't really see anything. But as it scans over, there was 50 plus Russian dead bodies just stacked in that trench. There, I've seen trenches just full of dead bodies, and multiply the case, and also fields outside of Bakhmut. I showed you those. Well, I didn't show you, but I had to put a box over it. But there are two images of two different fields, just littered with Russian bodies, just littered, in all hundreds of Russian dead. Again, what hypothesis does that better support? And building on previous points, as defenders, the Ukrainians have been able to use their knowledge of the local area to their advantage. They have also been able to booby trap and destroy buildings in order to gain an advantage or destroy Russian troops. We've seen evidence that they are doing this. We've seen buildings being blown up so that the Ukrainians have better tactical advantage, or Russians don't have a tactical advantage, or that it just kills Russian troops outright, or whatever. Bakhmut is a difficult place for the Russians to attack and take without taking serious casualties in the process. Moving on, when we look at the force quality of the Russian forces, it is poor, with historically a large contingent of convict recruits. So a couple of headlines here. Russia's private army is choosing numbers over quality amid struggles. So they're much more likely to have been sending numbers, poorly trained convicts instead of really well-trained Russian soldiers. They are choosing quantity over quality. And Russia using poorly trained convicts as Ukraine assault continues, says UK intelligence. Lots of examples, and we can even get this kind of idea from Russian primary sources themselves. Lots of examples of poor training and quantity over quality. We have heard of situations of where people have just been dragged onto the front line with no training at all, and sent into the not just into helping to supply personnel for second or third echelon, but for those vanguards, those first echelons, and throwing them directly into frontline conflict. And that's happened in Bakhmut, and we have seen plenty of evidence of that. Okay, Russians have not used mechanized equipment in any large scale. The entire offensive has been broadly infantry heavy, with their air force being brought in only later in the conflict to a greater degree. So we're starting to see the FAB 500 bombs being used, and aircraft being used. We're starting to see TOS 1A thermobaric munitions being used, but that has not been the case. And in fact, it's still fairly sparse. This has not been a conflict zone where we have seen tanks and APCs used in any great quantity. Almost all the footage we've seen of Bakhmut has been humans, artillery on humans, maybe, but humans, uh, as in lots of humans on foot doing trench warfare, storming buildings, running from here, running to there. And again, if the Russians are going to be doing that, if they're not going to be bringing mechanized equipment to bear here, then what hypothesis would that better support? Here we've got a couple of headlines. A headline here: Putin left humiliated after Wagner head blames failing attacks on lack of equipment. Mr. Prigozhin is seen addressing his troops in a video. I showed you this video actually, where they discuss the lack of equipment which is hindering their progress in the city. He said, "We are lacking vehicles, BMP-3, 100mm shells in order to move through Bakhmut quicker and with more confidence. We're lacking ammunition and armored vehicles." A Wagner soldier agreed with the leader, saying, "We don't have enough equipment, not enough BMP-2 and shells." So this, not only have we not seen any video evidence, particularly of mechanized equipment, but we have Russians themselves claiming that they don't have that equipment. Indeed, when we saw a T-90 tank being used in Bakhmut, I showed you that video because it was so unusual. Here is a Russian tank being used in the conflict. And I think I've seen one IFV being used with 30mm autocannon, and I've seen that on both sides. But yeah, just one for the Russians. So it's just sparse use of mechanized equipment and combined arms warfare, which means that are Russia likely to be doing really efficient warfare where they are absolutely taking out the Ukrainians using a whole mix of different aspects of the military machine? No, we've seen them throw humans at the problem. And again, it plays into that same idea that this is just a very troop heavy attritional conflict, and this will have hurt the Russians a lot. Prigozhin has himself complained about the lack of ammunition and equipment. This would indicate that his forces don't have enough to do the job efficiently or well. So, just moving aside from mechanized equipment, just onto ammunition here, Prigozhin publicly posted about the lack of ammunition from the Russian MOD, posting there was a leaked by himself Excel spreadsheet, and then we've got lots of other sources. So here is Levent Kamal saying, "My latest sources told MEE that Wagner had serious logistical problems, especially with weapons and ammunition, which resulted in losses. Instead of solving these problems, Prigozhin started new recruitment." So they never really have solved the issues that they've got with equipment provision, but instead have been desperate to get more and more troops on the front line. If we don't have the good enough weaponry, then at least we can throw humans at the problem. So again, this feeds into that same kind of idea that this is a very attritional, personnel, expensive project for the Russians. Prigozhin himself complained that they have been losing 5 times as many troops as would be otherwise expected. Now, some people are interpreting what he said as that being a 5-to-1 troop loss ratio, 5 Russians to 1 Ukrainian. Actually, it's not what he said. He basically said we're losing 5 times fewer. We would be losing 5 times fewer the amount of people had we had the right amount of equipment and ammunition. So that's him again, the head of the Wagner PMC, saying because we don't have all of this stuff, this is a conclusion I've been saying, that they'll be losing way more troops because they don't have X, Y, and Z. And he's saying we're losing 5 times as many troops because we don't have X, Y, and Z. 5 times as many troops than we would otherwise be losing. So, okay, the pro-Russian might say, I don't believe in that psyop. So it's interesting that your Russian primary source, you don't believe when it doesn't suit you. Of course, he is trying to say these things for leverage, but actually, this fits in with all the data that we are having access to here. So this is what I would expect. This is what Prigozhin is claiming, and he's saying we need more stuff because we're losing this many troops. And yeah, I would agree that that's the case, and that he probably does need more stuff so that he doesn't lose as many troops. And indeed, yesterday it was, or the day before, he said that he lost 99 troops to gain 230 meters. Actually, that was on the back of losing 94 the day before for 100 to 150 meters of progress. So you add that together on a daily basis, and you are losing, a lot of troops over. I mean, you can do the maths here, but obviously it depends whether that's consistent. It appears that the amount of troops that Russia are losing, that the Ukrainians claim Russia are losing, is what Prigozhin himself says that they are losing. So, and that's only the Wagner forces. That's not to mention all the VDV and DPR and other elements of the Russian military that are active in Bakhmut area and around the, to the north and to the south as well. So Prigozhin is being a front of quite a lot of confirmatory evidence here, if that's a word. There have been open and public disputes between Wagner and the Russian MOD. This would indicate that things won't be going as well as they possibly could for the Russian forces. This is kind of like a bit of a sidebar, something to add to the cumulative case here. But there's been all of these reports over and over and over that Prigozhin, in fact, Prigozhin himself is very public about this. He and the MOD don't get on. And if you're going to have forces that require, so to attack an urban environment like this, you need really good coherence together forces that are working cooperatively to the best of their abilities, planning, they're strategizing together, all the different elements working together to get the best results you possibly can. You've got all the things I've already talked about going wrong, and then you have a massive argument between the main PMC unit or the main PMC army in the area and the regular Russian forces, which will also be the Air Force and logistics, ammunition. So all of this stuff, equipment. If these guys aren't getting on, you are not going to be operating to the best of your abilities. And then you can add into that now we're hearing that Gazprom have got their own PMC there. We've got Wolves and all these and Redoute and all these other PMCs that don't get on with each other, and they're these very public arguments. And then each of them saying, "Well, they went in, they didn't realize, and they got blown up because they didn't know what we know." I was like, okay, well, and then they did this, but then we didn't support them, or they didn't support us, and all these claims have been going on with these different PMC outfits. That again, what hypothesis does that better support? On and on and on, and I could go on, but basically that's a good place to end there. I mean, aside from all of that, of course, there's just the reams and reams of footage. I don't know that you have a ream of footage, but the reels of footage in old school speak that we have to show all the Russian losses. And yes, the Ukrainians are losing as well, and yes, it is being costly for them. But the argument is that it is not as costly for them as it is for the Russians, and that's why the Ukrainians are still there, and that's why they are still hanging on. So when I say the Russians are losing more than the Ukrainians, and I don't particularly put a ratio on, I don't like giving definite numbers or ratios. I just say they're losing more than, probably a lot more than the Ukrainians, and that's as far as I go. And if the Russians going to say, well, what evidence do you have for that? Here is a whole bunch of arguments and evidence to suggest that that is the case. And it is highly unlikely that the Ukrainians would be losing more than the Russians. I just can't see that happening. They just wouldn't still be there, and all of this evidence that we have and all these arguments would just be turned on their heads. And the probability of that happening in 13 different cases of those arguments supporting one hypothesis, but the other hypothesis actually being true, like the probability of that is astronomically low. And so therefore, yeah, I think it's fairly obvious that the Russians are losing somewhat more than the Ukrainians, and almost certainly a lot more troops than the Ukrainians in the Bakhmut area. That has been closing down, I would argue, as it's become more and more difficult for the Ukrainians, but it still is, almost certainly still is in their favor. The Russians don't suddenly have greater trained troops with better equipment. Yes, the regular Russian army is there, and the conventional forces are there, and they are using the Air Force to a better degree, but it's counter battery fire that's taking place. There's arguably, although they do have artillery in the area, they're still complaining about shell hunger, and they're still complaining about counter battery fire, etc., and drone activity, so on and so forth. So it's that's my conclusion. I'd be interested to see what you think. Are there any other arguments that you would throw into this? Of course, the other thing that I haven't really mentioned is the actual stats that the Ukrainians claim on a daily basis. That is evidence. I mean, the Ukrainians are claiming, look, we've got evidence here. We've got evidence that the Russians have lost these. We're not going to share that evidence with you, but we have got it, so they claim. And here are the stats. So they are at least claiming that. And there's another piece of evidence to throw in here that the Ukrainians are claiming that this is the case very explicitly with the numbers. So there you go. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all the wonderful support you guys give. And if pro-Russians in the threads make these sort of arguments, point them in the direction of this video. Anyway, take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.